Mail order bride rejected for albinism until a rancher's orphan, whispered Mama. The stagecoach door groaned open, spilling Alba into the sun-scorched plaza of Stone Creek. The town wasn't a place, it was a judgment. The air hung thick with suspicion, fear, and a brittle, cruel piety. Silence fell like a guillotine. Hammers stopped. Every eye sharp as broken glass fixed on her, the ghost bride. Her skin white as bone and hair like spun silver marked her not as a woman, but as an omen. She held her chin high, a porcelain statue of defiance against their hostile stares. This contract was her last shot at a life, a desperate flight from the gawking crowds and whispers of curse that had shadowed her since birth. She scanned the faces, searching for the man who had summoned her. She found him. Caleb, a widower carved from granite and grief whose eyes offered no welcome. He made no move to claim his purchase. Alba clutched her worn satchel, a silent vow forming in her heart. She hadn't survived this long to be broken by a town of bad eggs. But as she took her first step, she knew this wasn't a sanctuary. It was a crucible. The sun was a hammer and Stone Creek was the anvil. It was a town bleached of all color, all softness baked into the brown cracked earth under a vast and punishing sky. When the stagecoach door groaned open, it was not a woman who stepped out, but a gasp of winter in the heart of a furnace. Alba. Her name was a secret she held tight behind her teeth. To them, she was an apparition. The dust, a fine red powder, refused to cling to the hem of her stark white dress. Her hair, a cascade of silver thread, seemed to drink the brutal sunlight and turn it into a soft, ethereal glow. Her skin was the color of polished bone. The town held its breath, a collective, fearful stillness. The blacksmith's hammer, which had been ringing a frantic beat, fell silent. Laughter from the saloon died in a man's throat. Women pulled their children close, shielding their eyes as if from a blasphemy. Tarnation. The stagecoach driver muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. He looked at the man striding forward, a figure carved from the unforgiving land itself. "She's all yours now, Caleb. Signed and paid for." Caleb did not look at the driver. His eyes, the color of a storm-clouded sky, were fixed on Alba. There was no welcome in them. No cruelty either. There was only a profound, weary emptiness, a barren field where nothing could grow. He had the look of a man who had buried too much of his own soul and had no room for another's. "The wagon's this way," he said. His voice was gravel. The words were not an invitation, but a command. Alba gave a single sharp nod, her gaze sweeping past him for a moment to the small girl standing by the wagon. The child was a miniature of the man, still silent, with eyes that held ancient sorrows. But where the townspeople stared with fear and hatred, the girl, she only watched. Her gaze was one of pure, unvarnished curiosity, a silent question in the oppressive heat. Why wasn't she afraid? The ride to the ranch was a long, rattling silence. The world outside the wagon was a blur of sagebrush and stone, a landscape that promised nothing but hardship. Alba felt a strange kinship with it. She, too, was a creature of harsh light and stark contrasts, a soul scraped bare by the world's judgment. The contract folded and worn in her satchel had been as sparse as her new husband's words. A wife to tend the house and the child. A transaction. A flight from one prison to another. The ranch was a testament to his grief. A weathered cabin, a sturdy barn, a corral of splintered wood. There were no flowers, no laughter etched into the porch rails. It was a place of function, of survival, a fortress against feeling. "Your room," Caleb said, gesturing to a small airless chamber at the back of the cabin. It contained a narrow cot, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out onto nothing but the endless empty plains. He turned to leave his duty done. "The child." Alba's voice was soft, but it stopped him in the doorway. "What is her name?" Caleb's shoulders stiffened. He did not turn around. "Clara." He said the name, a stone, dropping into a deep well. She don't talk. He walked out the screen door, slamming behind him with a sound of finality. She don't talk. The words echoed in the silence of the room. Alba sank onto the lumpy cot, the weight of 1,000 desolate miles pressing down on her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A ghost in a house of ghosts. A faint creak. She looked up. The door, which hadn't been fully latched, had swung open a few inches. In the gap stood Clara. The child's eyes were fixed on her, wide and searching. She took a hesitant step into the room, her small bare feet silent on the floorboards. She clutched something in her fist. Alba remained perfectly still, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Clara walked forward until she stood right before Alba's knees. Slowly, she opened her hand. Resting in her palm was a small, perfectly smooth, egg-shaped stone. It was as white as Alba's own skin. An offering, a question, a mirror. "Hello, Clara," Alba whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "That's a very beautiful stone." The girl didn't smile. She didn't make a sound. She simply looked from the stone in her hand to Alba's face, a flicker of understanding passing through her deep, silent eyes. With a slow, deliberate movement, she placed the white stone on the edge of the cot, then turned and slipped out of the room as silently as she had come. Alba stared at the stone, a single point of connection in a world of rejection. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window pane, a low, mournful sigh across the plains. She had survived the first day, but as she picked up the small, cool stone, she knew the true wilderness she had to cross was not one of dust and rock, but of two hearts frozen in a winter of their own. And she had no map. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a blade of sharp white light that sliced across the plains. Alba was awake long before it crested the horizon. She lay on the narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. The low groan of the windmill, the distant mournful call of a cow, the restless stirring of a house that had been sleeping with one eye open for a very long time. On the floor beside her cot, the small white stone Clara had left sat like a single unanswered prayer. Outside, Caleb was already moving. He worked with a fierce, punishing rhythm, his movements fueled by a grief that had long ago curdled into relentless motion. He saw her emerge from the cabin as the sun rose, a figure of impossible whiteness against the dusty browns and faded greens of his land. His first wife, Sarah, had been all vibrant color, the red of the wild primrose, the gold of the autumn cottonwoods. Alba was the absence of it. A ghost walking in the daylight. The town was right, a bitter voice whispered in his mind. She is an omen. He flinched from the thought, his hands tightening on the axe handle. He'd made a bargain. He needed a woman to run the house, to keep the ghosts of neglect at bay. That was all. His heart was a locked room, the key, long since buried with Sarah. He could not let another soul inside. Alba moved through the cabin with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. The house was a shrine to his late wife, every object thick with the dust of her absence. Alba cleaned not to erase, but to honor. She aired out the stale rooms, scrubbed the floors, and polished the tarnished silver, her touch gentle, respectful. She found a faded blue ribbon tucked in a drawer, and after a long, still moment folded it carefully and placed it back. A quiet acknowledgement. A promise not to replace, but to coexist. Clara was her shadow. The child followed her from room to room, a silent, watchful satellite. She never spoke, never made a sound, but her presence was a constant questioning hum. One afternoon, as Alba was kneading a heavy loaf of bread, her knuckles pushing into the pliant dough, Clara stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the light. Alba felt her gaze. Without looking up, she tore off a small piece of dough and set it on the table. An invitation. Clara hesitated for only a second before she crept forward. Her tiny hands, so unlike Alba's long, pale fingers, picked up the dough. She began to knead it, mimicking Alba's rhythmic push, and fold her small face a mask of intense concentration. "Your father works hard," Alba said softly, her voice a low murmur that didn't demand a reply. "He will be hungry." That evening, the three of them sat at the supper table. The silence was a fourth presence, heavy and suffocating. Caleb ate quickly, his eyes fixed on his plate. "The well pump is sticking," he finally said, the words dropping like stones into the quiet. "Needs grease. I will see to it in the morning," Alba replied, her voice even. Caleb looked up, a flicker of surprise in his guarded eyes. "You know about pumps?" Alba met his gaze, and a faint, sad smile touched her lips. "I know about things that are broken." The words hung in the air between them, layered and sharp. He heard the hidden meaning, a truth that struck too close to the bone. He said nothing more, retreating back into the safety of his silence. Later, after the dishes were washed and the cabin was still, Alba saw a small object on the floor by the hearth. A tiny hand-carved wooden bird, its wings half spread in flight. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate knife marks. It was a thing of simple, heartfelt beauty. She made them. Alba turned. Clara was standing there, pointing a small finger toward a high, dusty shelf. Alba followed her gaze and saw a row of them. A dozen small wooden animals, each one carved with the same loving detail. Sarah's work. Clara took the bird from Alba's hand, then did something that made Alba's breath catch in her throat. The child reached out and took Alba's hand, her small, warm fingers wrapping around Alba's cool ones. She led her to the shelf, her silent tour a sacred sharing of her mother's memory. From the darkened doorway, Caleb watched unseen. He had come back inside for his tobacco pouch and stopped dead. The sight of that pale, ghostly hand intertwined with his daughter's standing before the memorial of his dead wife sent a cold, complicated shock through him. It was a violation, an intrusion, and yet it was the first time in over a year he had seen his daughter willingly touch another living soul. He felt like a man standing on a cliff's edge in a storm, the ground crumbling away beneath his feet. He quietly backed out of the room, the image burned into his mind. This house of ghosts now had a new one, and he feared she was the most dangerous of all, for she was beginning to wake the others. Weeks bled into a quiet, fragile rhythm. The ranch became a world unto itself, an island in a sea of dust governed by the rising and setting of the sun. But the world was running out. The flour sack was a whisper of its former self, the salt was nearly gone, and the coffee beans were a memory. The trip to Stone Creek could no longer be postponed. Caleb's dread was a physical thing, a cold knot in his gut. He thought of leaving Alba behind, but the image of her alone in the vast emptiness with Clara was impossible. And leaving Clara, his silent, watchful Clara, was a line he would never cross. So they rode together, the three of them on the wagon bench, a strange, mismatched family heading towards their judgment. The moment the first buildings of Stone Creek came into view, the air changed. It grew thick with a poison that had been brewing in their absence. The stares were no longer just curious or fearful. They were hard, cold, accusatory. Windows were shuttered as they passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They were not just outcasts. They were a contagion. Inside the mercantile, the chill was absolute. Henderson, the proprietor, was polishing the counter, but his movements were stiff, his back a wall of deliberate ignorance. Need flour, salt. Coffee. Caleb set his voice flat. Henderson grunted, sliding the sacks onto the counter without a word. "That'll be $3. Caleb's jaw tightened. A week ago, it would have been half that. "That's robbery, Henderson." The man finally looked up, his eyes small and mean. "Supply and demand, Caleb. A man who brings a curse into town shouldn't be surprised when things get costly. Folks are saying the well water's been tasting thin ever since she arrived. Pay up or carry your curse elsewhere. Caleb's hand balled into a fist, but he saw the hard faces of the other men in the store watching, waiting. He was cornered. He threw the coins on the counter, the sound a sharp, angry crack in the hostile silence. Outside, Alba waited. She sat on the wagon, a statue of white stillness, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains. She felt their hatred like a physical touch, 1,000 tiny needles on her skin. Then came the children. Bolder, now fed by their parents' fear, they crept closer. Ghost one boy whispered loud enough to be heard, which another one hissed. A small sharp stone flew through the air, hitting the wooden side of the wagon with a sharp thwack just beside her head. Alba didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply turned her head and looked at them. And in her eyes, the color of a pale dawn sky, there was no anger. There was only a vast, profound sorrow. A sorrow for them, for the ugliness they were being taught to carry. Clara, who had been sitting beside her, saw it all. The thrown stone, the hateful words. She looked at Alba's sad, still face. Then, in a movement that was fierce and protective, the little girl stood up on the bench, moved closer to Alba, and slid her small warm hand defiantly onto Alba's arm. A silent shield, a declaration of loyalty. Caleb strode out of the mercantile, his face a thundercloud, just in time to see it. The ring of taunting children falling silent under Alba's mournful gaze. His daughter's small hand a fierce anchor on the pale arm of the woman he'd tried so hard to keep at a distance. A surge of raw protective fury rose in him so hot it nearly choked him. But it was a tangled thing. He was furious at the children at the town that had poisoned them, and at himself for bringing her here, for exposing her to this. He saw her then not as a fragile liability, but as a woman weathering a storm with a strength he could not comprehend. Caleb, a voice boomed, stopping them as they prepared to leave. Preacher Eli stood before them, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. His face was a mask of righteous fury. This is an affront that creature is a blight on this God-fearing community. Her unnaturalness invites evil. You must send her away for the sake of your own soul and the soul of this town. The world seemed to narrow to that dusty patch of ground. Caleb looked at the preacher's twisted face. He felt Clara's small form pressed against Alba. He heard the echo of the stone hitting the wagon. She is my wife. Preacher Caleb said the words feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. She stays. The preacher's eyes narrowed. Then you will find this town has a long memory, Caleb, and the Lord has ways of punishing those who choose to walk in shadows. The ride home was a long, deep silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of the day, with the weight of lines drawn and choices made. Caleb kept stealing glances at her, at the silver hair blowing in the wind, at the calm set of her jaw. He was a man who understood breaking things. He did not understand this woman who refused to be broken. They arrived back at the ranch as the sun was bleeding its last colors across the sky. While Caleb unhitched the weary horses, Alba lifted a sleeping Clara from the wagon. The children. Caleb started, his voice rough, unable to look at her. They shouldn't have. Alba paused, her gaze on the horizon where the first star was making its stand against the encroaching dark. They are only children, she said, her voice soft as moth's wings. They are just afraid of the dark. She turned her pale eyes to him, and they seemed to hold all the light that was left in the world. Someone just has to teach them where to find the light. Caleb stood frozen, the heavy leather harness slack in his hands. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time the ghost vanished. In its place stood a woman luminous and unbreakable in the twilight, and he felt the first terrifying crack in the ice around his heart. A fragile peace, thin as autumn ice, settled over the ranch. Caleb kept his distance, but the space between them was no longer a chasm of hostility. It was a quiet, watchful field of unspoken questions. He found himself noticing things. The way Alba's hands were surprisingly strong as she greased the stiff well pump. The low humming song she sang to the rising bread dough. The way Clara's silence seemed less heavy in her presence. Then the world began to hold its breath. The sky, for days a brilliant aching blue, turned the color of dull pewter. The wind lost its warmth and began to whisper a different tune, a high, sharp promise of ice. Alba stood on the porch, her silver hair unmoving in the heavy air, and looked to the north. "The sky is waiting," she said, when Caleb came to stand beside her. He squinted, a rancher's practical gaze scanning the horizon. "It's just a cold snap. We're due for one." But a disquiet settled in him. She saw the world in a language he did not understand, and he was beginning to learn she was rarely wrong. The snow began as a lie, a few gentle flakes drifting from the gray expanse. Within an hour, it was a fury, a whiteout. The world dissolved into a blinding, roaring whiteness, the wind a shrieking ghost against the cabin walls. The land, the sky, the horizon, all of it was gone, swallowed by the storm. The newborn Caleb yelled over the howl of the wind bursting back into the cabin. The calf and its mother, they didn't make it back to the barn. They're in the far pasture. "You cannot go out in this," Alba said, her voice sharp with alarm. "It will kill you. They're my responsibility." He bit out his jaw, set like iron. Duty was the one thing he had left to cling to. He pulled on his heaviest coat, ignoring the plea in her eyes. "I'll be back before moonrise." He plunged into the storm, a man warring against a god made of ice and wind. Inside the cabin groaned under the assault. The wind was a physical beast clawing at the roof, shaking the very foundations. Alba held Clara, humming a low, steady tune to counter the scream of the storm. Then came a sound unlike the wind. A sharp, terrible crack, like a bone snapping. It came from above. With a deep, groaning roar, a heavy support beam burdened by a season's worth of sod, and now a foot of wet, heavy snow gave way. A section of the roof collapsed inward, bringing with it a cascade of ice mud and suffocating snow. The deluge hit the hearth, extinguishing the fire in a single hissing gasp. Darkness, and a sudden, profound, biting cold. Clara was thrown from Alba's arms, a small cry torn from her before she was silenced. Clara Alba shouted, scrambling in the pitch-black, freezing chaos. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but she beat it back. This was a different kind of darkness, but darkness was a country she knew. Her pale eyes, a curse under the prairie sun, became a gift here. In the deep, featureless gloom, she could perceive shapes, outlines, the subtle difference between shadow and deeper shadow. She saw the child, a small dark shape, pinned in a corner by the fallen beam. Clara wasn't crying. She was frozen in a silence more terrible than any scream. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Alba began to dig. She clawed at the snow and frozen mud with her bare hands, her fingers quickly growing numb. She worked with a focused, desperate grace, her mind clear and sharp. She was a healer. And this was a wound in their home. She reached Clara, pulling her free from the debris. The child was icy cold, shivering violently. Alba stripped off her own shawl, wrapping it around Clara's small body, then huddled them both into the driest corner, shielding her from the snow, still whispering down from the hole in the roof. They would freeze to death if they stayed here. Her gaze fell on her own small, intact room. A sanctuary. She carried Clara there, then worked with a feverish ingenuity. She built a nest of their bedding. She found Caleb's bottle of whiskey, tore a strip from her own petticoat to make a wick, and set it in a heavy iron skillet. With shaking hands and a piece of flint from the useless hearth, She struck a spark. Once, twice. A tiny flame caught blue and hesitant, then grew into a small, precious, life-giving fire. Hours later, Caleb stumbled towards the cabin, a ghost of a man encased in ice. The calf was a dead weight on his shoulders, its mother lost to the storm. He had almost surrendered to the soft, warm allure of freezing to death, but the image of two faces, one silent and beloved, one pale and unnerving, had driven him on. He saw the collapsed roof, and his heart stopped. "Clara," he roared, his voice raw, bursting through the door into the frozen, ruined main room. Silence. Despair, absolute and final, seized him. They were gone. Buried. Then he saw it. A faint, impossible flicker of light from Alba's room. He kicked the door open and froze the scene before him, shattering the very foundations of his world. In the small room, a tiny fire burned with a steady, defiant glow. Huddled beside it, wrapped in every blanket they owned, was Clara, sleeping peacefully. And sitting guard over her was Alba. Her face was smudged with soot, her silver hair wild and untamed, glowing like a halo in the firelight. She looked exhausted, battered, and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. She looked up at him, her pale eyes holding his. In them he saw no fear, no accusation. He saw only the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who had stared into the heart of the storm and had created light in the darkness. He stood there, speechless, the dead calf slipping from his shoulders to the floor with a soft thud. He had left her a ghost. He had returned to find a guardian. Caleb stood in the doorway, a man shipwrecked in his own home. Behind him, the wind howled through the gash in the roof, a symphony of chaos. Before him, in a small circle of impossible light, was a scene of profound, defiant peace. The foundations of his world, the rigid walls of his grief, the cold certainty of his loneliness had been shattered as completely as his roof. He stumbled forward, the strength that had carried him through the blizzard draining out of him all at once. He did not fall, but sank to the floor near the small, miraculous fire, a slow surrender of a body and a soul that could fight no more. The cold had seeped into his bones, but it was a deeper chill one that had lived in him for over a year that was finally beginning to thaw. Alba rose without a word. She moved not with the timid deference of a hired wife, but with the quiet authority of a healer. She took a cloth, dipped it into a pan of water melted from the snow, and knelt before him. Wordlessly, she began to clean the ice and frozen blood from his raw, chapped hands. Her touch was not intimate, not proprietary. It was the simple, profound gesture of one survivor tending to another. "The roof?" He managed his voice, a hoarse rasp. "It is only wood and sod," she replied, her own voice low and steady, a calm anchor in the raging storm of his failure. "It will hold until morning." He looked at her, then truly looked. The soot on her cheek was a dark smear against her pale skin. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding from digging through the debris. The ghost he had feared was flesh and blood, a creature of grit and fire. He had faced the storm and failed. She had faced the ruin it left behind, and had created warmth and light and life. He thought of Sarah, of the vibrant, laughing woman he had lost. For a year, he had honored her memory by keeping the world out, by turning his heart to stone. He realized now that he hadn't been honoring her. He had been worshiping his own grief. He had judged Alba with the same blind fear as the town seeing only her strange, pale surface, because he was terrified to look at the depths within. He was ashamed. The feeling was so new, so sharp, it was a physical pain. It was in that moment of silent, shattering truth that Clara began to stir. The child shifted in her nest of blankets, her small face soft with sleep. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw her father safe and home, and a flicker of relief crossed her features. Then her gaze moved to Alba, who was still gently tending to Caleb's hands. A slow, warm, trusting smile bloomed on the child's face. She pushed herself up, her movements still drowsy. She reached out a small hand past her father directly to Alba. Her tiny fingers, warm with sleep, touched the soot-smudged cheek. And then she spoke. Her voice was a small thing, thin and rusty from a year of silence. But the word was as clear and bright as a star in a winter sky. Mama. The word was a thunderclap in the small room. It was a miracle. It was an earthquake. It struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at his daughter, the child who had been lost to him in the silent, haunted country of grief. She was looking at Alba, her expression one of utter, unquestioning love. Alba froze, her hands stilling on Caleb's. Her pale eyes widened, and a single hot tear, she didn't know she was crying, escaped, tracing a clean, startling path through the grime on her cheek. She was speechless, breathless, her heart a wild, chaotic symphony. For Caleb, the sound of his daughter's voice speaking that impossible word was the final blow. The dam of his sorrow, the one he had so carefully constructed of anger and duty and stoic silence, did not just crack. It disintegrated. A sound tore from his throat, a deep, ragged sob that was the sound of a year of unshed tears, of unspoken pain, of a heart finally, brutally breaking open. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of it. After a long moment, he looked up, his eyes raw. The walls between them were gone. The contract was ash. There was only the three of them huddled together in the heart of the storm. His voice was a broken whisper. She called you. I heard Alba breathed, her own voice trembling. He looked at her, and the shame, the gratitude, the wonder, it was all there in his gaze. He reached out his calloused, trembling hand, doing the one thing he had never done. He covered her hand with his, a silent acknowledgement, a plea, a thank you. He said her name, not as a label, not as a curse, but as a prayer. Alba. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world made new. A profound silence lay upon the land, a thick, pristine blanket of snow that buried the harsh brown earth under a shroud of grace. The light that filtered through the cabin's window was soft, pearlescent, and forgiving. Inside the small room, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers. The air was cold, but it was a clean cold, no longer threatening. Caleb sat on the floor, his back against the wall, watching. He watched the steady, peaceful rise and fall of his daughter's chest. He watched Alba, who was asleep in a chair, her head slumped to one side, a smudge of soot still on her cheek like a warrior's mark. The raw, violent emotions of the night had settled, leaving in their wake a quiet, fragile intimacy. He was not looking at a ghost or a contract or a burden. He was looking at his family. When the sun was higher, they worked. Together, they stepped into the ruined main room, the collapsed roof a gaping wound open to the sky. But the sight no longer filled Caleb with despair. It was just a broken thing, and broken things could be mended. The main beam is shattered, he said, his voice practical, but the gruffness was gone. We will need to cut a new one from the south grove. I can help strip the bark, Alba said, standing beside him, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. Clara can gather the small branches for kindling. It was the first time either of them had spoken of the future as a shared place, a place built with we. As they began to clear the debris, a line of dark figures appeared against the snow-bright horizon. Riders from Stone Creek. It was Preacher Eli and a small posse of townsmen, their faces grim, coming to survey the wreckage they believed God himself had wrought. The preacher dismounted his boots, crunching in the snow, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The wrath of the Lord is swift. Caleb, he boomed, his voice echoing in the clean, cold air. He has swept away the corruption. He has shown his displeasure with the unnatural presence you brought into this valley. Caleb straightened up. He walked out of the ruined cabin and stood before the men, placing his body between their world and his. Alba appeared on the threshold behind him, and Clara, awake now, immediately took her hand. Caleb's voice when he spoke was not loud. It was quiet. It was steady. It was as solid as the mountains. There is no unnatural presence here, preacher. The only thing unnatural is the hatred you carry in your heart. God didn't do this. A storm did. He paused, letting the words sink in. And my wife, he said the word, a shield, a vow, saved my daughter's life. Wife, the preacher spat his face, turning purple. You call that thing. Your wife, her name is Alba Caleb, said, his gaze unwavering. And this is her home. This is our home. He took a step forward. And you and your judgment are no longer welcome here. He turned his back on them, then a final, absolute severance. He walked back to the cabin to the two figures waiting for him. The preacher and his men stood there for a long moment, their authority broken, their pronouncements dissolving into the vast, indifferent silence. They turned their horses and rode away, defeated by a love they could not comprehend. Caleb stepped onto the porch. He looked at Alba, her silver hair a brilliant crown in the morning sun. He looked at Clara, who was now leaning her head against Alba's side, her small face content. He reached out and took his wife's hand. Beneath a broken roof, surrounded by a world of white, their life was just beginning.